Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and as you can see, we're back within the confines of the CDB TV studios once again after our recent jaunt to the Kendal Classic Revival Scramble. But of course, we will be packing our bags again within the next week or so as we head down to the Drumlandrig Castle racing weekend, so look out for that. But until then, we've just about enough time to fit in one more video before I go, and this is one of the bikes that we spotted at the recent Revival Scramble. So let's jump straight into that video and take a look at Jem Parker's lovely 1979 WR500 CCM. Yes, thanks again for coming back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and of course for your continuing support of my channel here on YouTube. Okay, so as I said, this next bike that we're going to take a look at is another one of the nice machines that I came across at the recent Kendal Classic Revival Scramble back in April of 2023. Now, we did, of course, take a very brief look at this bike when we did our paddock walkabout, but this time round we're going to get a much closer look at some of the more intricate components that have gone into this bike's construction. So essentially what we have here is a 1979 500 WR CCM, or Works replica if you like, and this bike was all refurbished and restored by Jem Parker at J+R Racing. So the story goes here that this bike was bought by Jem's dad way back in 1982, and by that time the bike was already on its third owner and rider since that year. But Jem's dad only really raced the bike for just the one season because he unfortunately then hurt himself in a racing incident whereby the bike was then simply parked in the corner of Jem's workshop, where it lay gathering dust for many years before Jem then got a bit fed up of looking at a good bike going bad. So he eventually took it upon himself to do something with his dad's old racer, and so he decided to embark on doing a full restoration. But this wasn't going to be a super quick freshen up type of job, and in actual fact, from the time that Jem started the project to get it into this immaculate condition, took him almost 5 years from start to completion. And so first up, let's just start with the bike's chassis, which is not a reproduction frame as we so often find on these new types of Clews restoration. This is a proper original CCM chassis, which is stamped as number 164 of the CCM production line in that year. Now, naturally, once Jem had stripped the bike down to the sum of its parts, the frame was one of the first things that received attention, and after an initial inspection just to see if any welding or other damage was needing seen to, the chassis, the swing arm and a few other small bits and pieces were then handed over to S&T platers in Bristol so that they could chrome plate these parts with brand new shiny chrome, which of course these 79 chassis did have in that year. But as you can see, the chassis is now back to as good as brand new condition once again. But once again, I'm sure that you're already aware that these CCM chassis were used as an oil storage tank to hold the lubricant for the bike's engine. So you simply filled the oil through this little filler plug just in front of the fuel tank, and then the oil was held in the frame's front down tube, where it then exited from the bottom of the tube, and then it was pumped around the motor and then of course back up into the chassis. And our featured CCM still has its original wire gauze type of oil filter system, which is basically just a little gauze wire filter that's housed in one of the bottom rails of the chassis, which you simply removed periodically and maybe washed it with petrol or other kind of solvent to clean it before then refitting it and topping up with clean oil. But many other CCM owners did upgrade this old system by fitting an external oil cartridge filter system to the outside of the chassis, as this upgrade was said to be much more efficient at cleaning up the oil. And of course, when it did get old and needed changing, you simply changed the cartridge for a brand new one, as you would do on your car at home whenever you were servicing it. Now, as we move on to the motor, which as you'd expect was completely stripped down and then rebuilt by Jem, and every single part on this motor was inspected and certainly had to pass Jem's very high quality control process before it was deemed fit to be used once again on the rebuild. But essentially, the big CCM engine is still based on the old BSA B50 motor that Allan Clews worked his magic on by performing some tuning mods and eventually turning what was at that time a pretty basic 4-stroke road bike power plant into a fire-breathing and highly competitive thumper motocross engine. So sitting inside this CCM power plant, we have an original BSA CCM crankshaft and also an NEB clutch and 3-speed gearbox. But I do remember that some of these 79 bikes did have the much more desirable 4-speed boxes as well. And also this is one of the 4-valve models that Jem has in his CCM chassis, and thankfully the motor's barrel has also been kept in its stock original condition, and Jem's not succumbed to performing the more modern upgrade usually done on these B50 engines by removing every second cooling fin on the cylinder to give the motor a much more modern type of look. And again, these big Clews motors had this very unique configuration of using the motor's engine casings to mount the bike's footrest hangers rather than the conventional method of just bolting or welding them onto the bike's frame. And although it may sound a little bit unorthodox and unusual, in practice it actually worked very well, with no reported cases of damage or breakages to either part. And once again, there were no tailpipes or mufflers of any kind on these CCM exhausts, as it was more or less just a big bore straight through pipe with a short connecting end pipe that exited out to the right hand side of the bike. But as you can see, this pipe is once again immaculate after its brand new re-chroming process at S&T Platers in Bristol in the UK. Although for an old school design, these B50 motors certainly packed a punch, and they were more than capable of taking on any of the big Japanese two-strokers of their day, when the likes of Big Bob Wright and Vic Eastwood and many of the other CCM Works riders of that period got astride one of these Allan Clews creations. More often than not, they'd certainly be up there battling at the sharp end of the pack. Now, not every single part on Jem's CCM is from 1979, and certainly these front suspension units aren't, of course, from that year, because Jem intends to get this bike back on the track very soon, and he didn't want to go with the bike's original forks because he thought that they wouldn't be up to the job, so he swapped them for a set of top and bottom fork yokes from a 1988 CR Honda, and I'm pretty sure that the front forks and the hub are from a 1983 CR Honda model. And as you can see, by using Honda forks on this bike, gives her quite a long pair of legs with plenty of travel and scope for making tuning adjustments to the rebound and the damping. But original to the bike or not, these Honda forks will certainly be a lot better than the Allan Clews stock ones from 1979. So once again, at the front end of the bike, because we're using 1983 Honda forks, the front hub is also a Honda part from that year, and this of course has the twin leading shoe front brake setup, which will again be a much more powerful stopper than the CCM Clews original. But as we move on to the rear hub, which actually is the original 1979 magnesium CCM hub, which is a bit of a rarity because these stock original magnesium parts for these bikes are so rare to find these days, and back in the day Allan Clews did use quite a few magnesium parts on these bikes, including triple clamps and bottom fork tube casing, and of course these front and rear hubs as well. Now at the rear end of our Jem Parker CCM we have a set of quite good quality YSS piggyback suspension units, which again are an upgrade on the original shocks that would have been bolted onto these CCMs in that year, which I think would more than likely have been a set of Girlings back then, but as those old British-made Girling suspension units are no longer available, and certainly these YSS units are still a massive improvement over those old school suspension units. But there's no mistaking the shape and the colour of this CCM fuel tank, which again is the original part and not a modern day reproduction item, as many of the refurbished CCMs nowadays tend to be, although this fuel cell once again was completely stripped of its old tired paint and then given a brand new colour coating with of course brand new graphics as well, just to make it look even better than it did when it was brand new. Now the original seat that was fitted to Jem's dad's bike was a bit worse for wear after its 44 years or so pounding racetracks, and to be fair, much of it was just too far gone to be able to be reused on the bike's refurbishment, and so a reproduction seat base, foam and cover were then located and fitted onto the bike, and as you can see these are almost indistinguishable from the 1979 originals. But up at the business end of our WR500 CCM, naturally all of the stock handlebars, cables, levers and controls have now been replaced with new items, mainly because, as I said, the bike's eventually going to be raced on the track again, so we don't want to be using 44-year-old controls when this big brute starts to fly. So we have a decent pair of rental bars with this Domina throttle gasser to help control all of the horses from that big 4-banger CCM motor. Alongside that we have of course period correct Magura levers and their rubber lever covers just to keep dust and dirt from entering the lever pivots and the cable ends. But again, the cables are all new, as you'd expect, and also just as a little bit of extra insurance, we have an engine kill switch here on the left, just in case the rider encounters any problems with that CCM motor and it needs to be shut down in a hurry. Now, when it came to all of the plastics on our Jem Parker race bike, these once more have all been replaced, as the originals are now impossible to find, although I do believe that we have a couple of companies now who are making reproduction CCM plastics for these machines. But this front mudguard is actually a UFO part. Now, at the back end of our CCM, again, it's not an original part, but this time borrowed from a two-stroke YZ Yamaha motocrosser, although I have to say it still looks the part on our British-built Clews Classic. And just to finish off the plastics part of our Jem Parker CCM, these side panels are reproduction copies of the 79 originals, which I believe are now in plentiful supply. So even although this bike here isn't a fully stock original item from 79, you have to admit that it's still a fantastic looking machine, which let's not forget, it still has the original CCM chassis, motor and fuel tank, and many of the other stock items from that year. And this particular CCM was of course never ever built to be a garage queen or concourse winner, but it just so happens that I was there to capture the bike just before it took to the track. And I've seen quite a few of the projects that Jem and J+R Racing have turned out in the past, and they've all been very high quality pieces of kit. But for me, this recent WR500 Clews bike that Jem's refurbished from what was originally his dad's old race bike is without doubt up there with some of the best bikes that he's produced. And let's face it, there's certainly no other better looking British made 4-stroke motocrosser on the planet than one of these Allan Clews CCM classics. Well, so there you have it, a lovely old classic there. Not of course a fully original bike, but nonetheless a beautiful restoration by Jem Parker on his father's old CCM. But as I said, next up we are heading to Drumlandrig Castle for our annual race event, and don't forget that you can see all of the bikes and all of the racing action from that weekend right here on my channel. So until the next time, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well, and for the time being, it's goodbye from Classic Dirt Bike TV.